So the Black Ops 6 integration is here, and it's been a few days. I kind of want to let things settle out, and I want to talk a little bit about the pros and cons. The game is in a good spot if it were working properly, but there's also a lot of issues with the game. But I'll go ahead and kind of run through the positives and talk a little bit about the negatives. But overall, let's go through some positives. So we got the camos. I think that it's cool that Warzone finally has a unique camo. Regardless if you're going for it or not, I think that's a cool feature. Backpacks finally being gone. Remember, we had to do backpack looting. We had AI on the map in Warzone 2. It introduced so many issues into the game that I'm glad we're finally getting away from that are really holding the game back. I think custom reticles is nice to have back. We didn't really have that since Cold War Vanguard around that time. And then once we went to Warzone 2, we kind of eliminated all that, and they really only came out with pay-to-win reticles. Not that they were actually pay-to-win, but the only way you can get different reticles is for buying a blueprint, which I thought was unfortunate. We do have a title update coming out very soon with this week's event. Normally, that allows them to do a bigger update that will address hopefully some of the outlying issues that are quickly fixed, and then some other issues that hopefully are bigger that they can also fix in the game. But they really haven't talked much. They've had a few things here or there like, oh, we're working on this, the audio's bugged, we're aware of this, but there's too many issues that they really haven't addressed. And then hopefully a lot of these will just be fixed as we get these future updates, as they have in the past. Always integrations are kind of a buggy mess, and if you've been through any of the integrations, we know that that's the case for pretty much all of them. Even back in Verdansk to Verdansk 84, tons of issues. From Verdansk 84 to Caldera, tons of issues, and every year it kind of ends up being like that. I think they create a class. It's cool that it's more simplistic. I know some people were upset about the overkill being gone, but now you got to use a wild card. I think that is a good way for the game to go, and it creates diversity in loadouts where you can have 5 attachment builds, 8 attachment builds, late game builds, all kinds of variety in your creative class. And that brings us to the meta is currently in a really good spot, probably the best it's been in years. We already have more weapon diversity in the first week of the game than we've had all last year. And that's including right now there are a few different ways to bug out your loadout where you get 8 attachments when it's really only 5, and you're able to use glitch, bugged, or broken weapons like the shotguns, the Doom shotguns, and the pistols. There's different things that are broken in the game that'll get fixed. They'll get reverted. Kind of weird that when you do these integrations, a lot of problems that they've solved already somehow make their way into it. I'm sure there's something that happens behind the scenes that causes these issues, because obviously Raven's working primarily on Warzone, and then Treyarch primarily working on multiplayer and zombies. And the execution of multiplayer and zombies is pretty good. And Raven, it's kind of like they have to start working on the integration within the year or so, because obviously they got to work based off, I don't know. I'm sure it's super complicated. End of day, it doesn't matter. Multi-billion-dollar company, they got to figure it out. The meta, I think, is in a really good spot where you're able to use multiple different weapons. There are some issues with some of the attachment balance, which we'll talk about in the cons or negative section, but in general I feel like there's a ton of viable options. Maybe not necessarily hard meta, but there's tons of variety that you can choose from if you prefer older games, and they've gone and changed some attachments to make it easier without all the cons, and it definitely modifies the viability of a lot of the older weapons. I think lootable perks being back is good. I think the perk packages combined with this, where you can kind of add up to have around 10 or so, or maybe 8 or so perks, is cool. I think the winner circle ending is pretty cool. I wish it had a little bit of voice chat like we originally had in Warzone 1. I think the UI update is awesome. Having everything laid out cleanly is nice for a change. Emotes and sprays, I never use them, but I know some people like those. Pings got nerfed, which is huge. A lot of times you're able to track through walls, essentially, where you ping someone, you can see them for half an hour. That is kind of got nerfed, and it's not nearly as strong, even though pings are still super powerful. I like the dedicated melee. And then Omni movement. I think Omni movement brings a lot to the table. I know a lot of people focus primarily on, oh, just diving. People aren't using the dive, but the reality is the sprinting in all directions, the sliding in all directions, and certain features related to the Omni movement in that aspect are super, like, they're very well executed, and the game feels night and day different. But I think they do gotta maybe tweak some stuff around that it'll get a little bit more optimized for the flavor that people want out of Warzone. Quick list of that's the pros. A lot of that's kind of expected, and I think when we get into the negatives, there's a lot of things that I'm seeing on the timeline, on Twitter, in the comment section, all these kinds of things. I think it's important to identify what is probably a bug or a feature. I know we made fun of this a lot during Modern Warfare 2's life cycle because you really didn't know. I think at this point there's a lot of things that they need to fix that is related to bugs, and then the way the game is designed feature based that they need to change to improve the quality of the game. I think one of the biggest issues that's holding the game back a lot right now is a lot of slow animations, and they've kind of tuned these to improve them over time, and this feels like one of the biggest reversions in my opinion. So reloading slow, there's lack of sleight of hand, which is kind of like one of those perks that you've gotten people accustomed to that should just be on by default, and I think that should just be built in or baked into another perk so that it makes it a little bit more advantageous. This is one of the things I mentioned before the update even dropped, and we had a good list of all the perks. Like, there's nothing to speed up your reload, and speeding up reload is pretty important in a fast-paced arcade shooter like Call of Duty. Weapon swapping is incredibly slow, so slow that a lot of times what will happen is if you weapon swap and then you're trying to loot the gun off the ground, you're way quicker and you'll end up dropping the primary gun that you originally swapped from. And you end up with some issues with that. So it's super slow. And one of the #1 perks that we had throughout the entire life cycle of pretty much Warzone 1 was the amped perk, which is the weapon swap speed. And it was like used at like 96%. Obviously there were some crap perks in perk 3, but in general it was used basically by every player, and it should be built in default where you're able to weapon swap faster. Mantling, also kind of slow. Some of the mechanics are just a little bit clunky on that side of it, and that just needs to be tidied up. Whether it needs to be baked into dexterity or default like we had with the mantling boots or whatever the heck they were called during MW3's life cycle, that needs to come back. Like, I don't care if the game has to be, we want them to be 1-to-1 to Black Ops 6. In the day, that just doesn't work. Those games are entirely different. The maps are medium to small maps. Black Ops 6 with zombies, they got their own flavor going on. Warzone kind of has to adjust and adapt to incorporate some of these problems. Ammunition, armor, utility box are all incredibly slow. This got fixed last year, and then this is reverted. So it's, you throw the box, you have to wait for it to open, and then it spits out the item. It's just really clunky, especially when we've gotten accustomed to being able to do things seamlessly. And I feel like that needs a reversion. I think the stim nerf was a little bit dramatic. Obviously, it was probably a little bit overpowered at lasting like 3 seconds at 30% boost speed. But realistically, I felt like where it is now and where it was, they should have probably gone halfway in between. So hopefully they revert this the same way that the feedback has been out there about like the XP tokens. They got rid of them. They said, oh, there's a bug that it creates instability in the game. I have no clue how. But the reason why you need stims to be powerful, in my opinion, is because what ends up happening is, well, if stim sucks, now you got to divert to the other options. Smokes are kind of like whatever. They're not particularly good or as good as they were in MW3. Then that pushes us to more of the toxic style tacticals like flashbangs and stuns, which those are probably the most annoying piece of equipment in the game, and they actually detract from the gameplay loop. When you get a kill using them, they don't feel particularly rewarding. When you get killed, somebody using them on you, that doesn't feel particularly fair or balanced. Obviously, they're in the game. They kind of always have been. But the reality is you want stims to be powerful, because if somebody uses stims on you, it feels like, dang, that person probably finessed me. If you're getting the kill with the stim, then it feels like, oh man, I outplayed them. But you don't really get that same feel with stuns or flashbangs. So that's why I think leaning towards stims being like the meta option is fine, because we don't want every gunfight to essentially be stuns and flashbangs. That kind of sucks. The lack of slide to fire attachments on MW2 and MW3 weapons will severely impact the close range meta options for MW2 and MW3. The slide to fire times on those weapons are just way too slow, and it kind of almost takes them out of viability unless you just got to change your play style just to not use any sliding, which is kind of counterintuitive when you're trying to close the distance with an SMG. You want to kind of slide into the action, hip fire initially, switch to the ADS, and then you get the kill. I think there's some kind of like tac sprint fatigue. It doesn't want you to do animations too quick. I think they got to figure out if that's a bug, they fix it. If it's not a bug, then they need to just make it so that you're able to deal with those animations a little bit quicker. That's sometimes what feels like you get these dead slides or feeling less responsive. And then we got the visibility in general. I don't know if it's just like everything feels like a blurriness. I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain because things look clear, but then it's hard to see things. And then you get things added on top of these things like the low resolution bugs that we had before last year that they ended up fixing. You get things looking like Play-Doh. There was a memory leak related things. And then there's additionally, when you get into the gas, the visibility in the gas is atrocious. They've done some things with it where obviously we saw some of these things at COD Next, which I'll talk a little bit about in playing early. Because one of the feedbacks I always see is like, why didn't you guys complain about this? And this, and we'll get into that. A quick little note about that after I've gone through this. I think the aiming sway is another problem that should have been gone. They improved it like 3 times throughout MW3's life cycle. And then it's like they chalked it all because they had to use an older version of the game. So some of these things got reverted, which just are trash. It needs to be a much smoother gameplay experience. I think bullet velocity can add on to some of the guns, and that'll also help. That's just an aside. Desync, netcode, whatever you want to call it, it feels like it's shoot first, die first. And that's why I've seen a lot of arguments about, oh, the TTK is too fast or the TTK is too slow. Well, with bad netcode, it's both. When you shoot people and they die slow, and then they use the same gun on you, and then you instantly get deleted, there's problems there that aren't related to the weapon balancing, and I think that leads to a lot of problems with people feeling like shoot first, die first, and that's a problem. Then we got the plethora of bugs, which they've either acknowledged or they're clearly bugs that need to be addressed. Clearly, the first big bug was the audio stuff. They said they addressed some of the stuff. Then they put out Rebirth Island. It had all these issues related to audio and visibility, and then they pulled it away with the playlist update. So audio, they got to figure out whatever the heck is causing those problems. There's a bunch of issues with creative class, with blueprints and not blueprints, 8 attachments and 5, and the buy station. They got to figure that out because that's a huge problem. Perks, there's several of the perks where they feel like they're not working because their impact isn't large enough. Whether it's bird's eye not doing what it's supposed to, dexterity, the mountaineer side of it, you get like, without dexterity, you fall from like 13 meters, you die. With it, you fall from 16, which really doesn't help. There's not a lot of scenarios where the building is exactly 15 meters and you would have died at one and not the other. So it's terrible. It needs to be fixed or improved to include the way Mountaineer was, because that's something like they've taken away from us essentially with not having that. And I get we didn't have it originally, but the gameplay loop with Mountaineer is so much better, especially if you want to be a little bit more aggressive. So I think that needs extreme buffs or improvements, because there's a lot of the perks where they just don't feel like they're working. High alert doesn't really feel like it functions well when it's really hard to notice when you're being looked at. Attachments, there's tons of attachments that feel like they're buggy. Loadout lags, or they reset. The kill cams aren't really, they're really like glitchy. The friends list doesn't work properly. You can't res teammates perfectly. Sometimes it'll bug out. So that's the bulk of it, but there's still a lot of other things that I'm sure I'll miss that the people are upset about in the comments section. End of story, a lot of these things will be fixed, right? At the end of the day, we know it because we've seen the pattern of them consistently breaking something, then they fix it, break it and fix it. Luckily, the game launched way earlier, so a lot of these will get fixed before the holiday, I would imagine, most of them. But let's go back to kind of when I was talking about, I had the opportunity to play the game early back in like June, and then I had again to play it at COD Next. And the gameplay from that time period did not have these issues, the visibility issues, the slow animations, the clunkiness. The audio was also significantly better, even better than the version of Warzone audio that we just recently had. A lot of times it's like, well, why didn't you complain then? Well, those weren't issues then. For whatever reason, when they have a small build, and then it works in this little bubble, they expand it to the bigger build, and it still works, and then they go to the live servers, then something breaks. So I know there's a lot of times people are just intellectually dishonest, and they'll say, oh, they don't even test their game clearly. Well, clearly, we played it early, it worked functionally well, it worked, and then they put it into live, and then it breaks. Well, you can't test live without making it go live. I don't know. It's just kind of how it works. They can do as much as they can to kind of predict problems, but things happen, things break in a live service game. It's just how it goes, unfortunately. End of day, it worked at one point, so I'm sure they'll be able to get it back there. How are you liking the game? I know it has its flaws. Some people are saying they're going to uninstall and never play it again until next year, or they love it and they're playing more than ever. Where do you guys sit? Appreciate all the support. Thank you for watching. As always, have a great day.